Okay, here's a little bit of a slideshow about the emperors of the first century after Augustus. Now, in the text that I've put online and your assigned readings and so on, it really provides most of the details that I really want you to be familiar with. So, what I've added here is I'm not just going to regurgitate information you're already familiar with, but introduce you to these emperors and maybe some other aspects of their reigns. And I'm actually kind of interested in providing you some kind of information or some texts and accounts from antiquity itself. That is, what did Roman writers have to say about some of these emperors? There were some biographers, especially Suetonius, that was working in the late first, early second century AD, who wrote biographies of these emperors, and it preserves a lot of these kind of anecdotes, descriptions, and so forth about these emperors. Now, on one hand, I just find these personally just kind of interesting, right? Some of them are obviously exaggerated and kind of taken to extreme, and obviously kind of made up in some way. But also, can be kind of insightful because it does let us know some of the reasons for which emperors were criticized, or some of the things that they had to take particular attention of. So, to say, it's supposed to be maybe a little bit amusing, but there's a point underneath it too. So remember, excuse me, the first emperor is, of course, Augustus, right? His reign stretching really long, like 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, and then he dies in 14. Now remember, no biological sons of his own, only a daughter by the name of Julia, and she turns out to be a bit of a disaster because of her behavior. So he turns, after running out of a couple options that he had in mind, on to Tiberius, who is the son of his wife Livia from a previous marriage. So Tiberius is actually his stepson. And I've talked about this it's in the readings as well. So we see pictures of Tiberius. This is him early on. Some people even argue that when you look at him, say this right here, he looks a little bit like Augustus. And some of you remember the Prima Porta Augustus and stuff like that. But the problem is, well, they're not related, so that's impossible. So some people have suggested that uh, in early on in his reign, that the sculptures were actually meant to recall Octavian and Augustus a little bit, just to make that transition a little bit easier. That is not as much of a kind of a shock or of a change. Now, what I really want to focus on here for these purposes is this time that Tiberius spends on Capri. Now, remember what's interesting. He's frustrated with life and politics in the capital, so what he decides to do is to retire to this island that's in the Bay of Naples. Naples is today maybe an hour and a half drive south of Rome, but it's a beautiful area, of course. It's where Pompeii is located, so we're going to be returning there. So it was a little bit of a kind of a resort area, within reach of Rome to go down there for a summer holiday and so forth. So a lot of prominent Romans had villas down there and so on in that area around the Bay of Naples. Anyways, Tiberius goes there and lives there. And as I say, for a place to retire, it is kind of tough to beat. Here's a picture I took kind of going over on the ferry. And then when you get there, you can see, I mean, now it's tourist trap, and you have to have a lot of money to really enjoy it well. But it's a beautiful spot. There's no doubt about that. And this is where he retires to. There's a villa of his that's there. So he has this huge kind of estate palace there. And he has a line of communication between Capri and Rome. So the Praetorian Guard helps him govern in a sense. There's a very famous Praetorian Guard at the time by the name of Sejanus that helps him do this. But what I'm kind of getting at is he actually never really returned to Rome, right? He's actually in for the next kind of 12 years of his life, basically more or less on Capri. And so he doesn't kind of make personal appearances in Rome. And this begins to be a bit of a problem because if you don't keep up a public presence in Rome, people start to wonder, like, what's he up to? And I think this is what other emperors would eventually learn is that you had to have a kind of public face. You had to have good PR so that people kind of know what you're doing and so on. And this is a problem, as I say, because stories started circulating about what he was up to down here. Because, of course, it had to be no good. That's just the way Romans thought. So take a look at this description from this writer Suetonius. All right, it's kind of crazy, but you'll watch it. So this is his description of what Tiberius was doing once he retired to Capri. Now, remember, this is written about a century later, but it's still, let's say, relatively contemporary. And the tales that Suetonius includes, no doubt, were in circulation in public conversation. Anyways, I'll just read through this. So on retiring to Capri, he made himself, that is Tiberius, he made himself a private sporting house where sexual extravagances were practiced for his secret pleasure. Bevies of girls and young men whom he had collected from all over the empire as adepts in unnatural practices, and known as spintrii, would copulate, have sex before him in groups of three to excite his waning passions. A number of small rooms were furnished with the most indecent pictures and statuary obtainable, also certain erotic manuals from Elephantis in Egypt. The inmates of the establishment would know from these exactly what was expected of them, that is, kind of sexual subservience. He furthermore devised little nooks of lechery in the woods and glades of the island, and had boys and girls dress up as pans and nymphs, prostituting themselves in front of caverns or grottos, so that the island was now openly and generally called Capernaum. Caper is the Latin word for goat, so it's Goat Island. But you can see, this continues in the next slide, which I'll include. People think that he's no good, up to no good, excuse me, and in Romanized, quite often that turns to kind of sexual practices, kind of perversion. So he continues, some aspects of his criminal obscenity are almost too vile to discuss, much less believe. Then he goes on to discuss them at length. Imagine training little boys whom he called his minnows to chase him while he went swimming and get between his legs to lick and nibble him, or letting babies not yet weaned from their mother's breast suck at his breast or groin. Such a filthy old man he had become. Then there was a painting by Parrhasius, which had been bequeathed him on a condition that, if he did not like the subject, he could have 10,000 gold pieces instead. Tiberius not only preferred to keep the picture, but hung it in his bedroom. And what does it show? It shows Atalanta, a figure from myth, performing fellatio with Meleager, so a sex scene. The story goes that once, while sacrificing, he took an erotic fancy to the attendant who carried the incense casket, and could hardly wait for the ceremony to end before hurrying him and his brother, the sacred trumpeter of the temple, and indecently assaulting them both. When they jointly protested at this disgusting behavior, he had their legs broken. Now, all these stories, I'm sure he probably, he got up some just no good to some sense, but this is clearly, kind of made up and supposed to be just like, oh, I can't believe it. But as to say, Romans, when they were criticizing people, it often took a kind of sexual nature or criticism of sexuality. But this, as I said earlier, it just goes to show you is that when you're not present publicly in a consistent way, people are going to wonder about things. Their minds are going to wander. So it was important, and we'll see later emperors do this, is that you had to keep a public presence. You had to show up, for example, in the Colosseum to let people that know that you're there and that you're kind of enjoying the same things that they are. Okay, so that's kind of one of the reasons. I find these stories just kind of funny, Roman sense of humor and so forth. But there is a point between them. Now he, remember, is succeeded by Gaius. Very short reign, 37 to 41. Now Gaius is more often known as Caligula. Okay, I'll explain that in a second. Now here he is, young man, right, and very wicked or whatever, a very nasty young guy. Now the thing to explain here is, of course, I was going to call him Caligula. Caligula wasn't, of course, the biological son of Tiberius. He's rather adopted. His father was a very prominent general by the name of Germanicus, a very kind of dashing figure who died young. Now, he was a general, and what he often did, what Germanicus did, is he took his family with him on campaigns. Now, this included Caligula, his sister Agrippina, and his wife. Now, what the troops would do, because Germanicus was very popular with his troops, is that they would dress up young Gaius, young Caligula, in a soldier's uniform. And the thing is that a key part of a soldier's uniform is the caliga. And this is what a caliga is. It's just basically the military shoe, like the military boot or whatever, a combat boot. Now, what you can see, Caliga and Caligula, the UL is a diminutive. So this doesn't mean, this means kind of boot. Caligula means little boots. And what it means is that they made him this uniform, and they thought it was really cute that he had these little miniature versions of the Caliga. So all the troops used to call him Caligula. It's often translated as kind of little boots. But anyways, the name stuck. The main thing here is just the accounts we have of his viciousness and his brutality. And just to give you a few examples here. Again, because this lets us know what maybe some of the stories that were circulating about him. So Suetonius, again, looking back, says, yet even in those days, meaning kind of early in his life, he could not control his natural brutality and viciousness. Caligula loved watching tortures and executions, and disguised in wig and robe, abandoned himself nightly to the pleasures of gluttonous and adulterous living. Tiberius, this is when Tiberius was still alive and Caligula was young, was ready enough to indulge a passion which Gaius had for theatrical dancing and singing, which you usually shouldn't do as a Roman, on the ground that it might have a civilizing influence on him. With characteristic shrewdness, the old emperor had exactly gauged the young man's vicious inclination. In other words, he knew he was a bad seed. And he would often remark that Gaius's advent portended his own death and the ruin of everybody else. I am nursing a viper for the Roman people, he once said, and a Phaethon for the whole world. Phaethon's a figure from myth. He steals the chariot of his father, the sun god, and he crashes them into the earth and kind of incinerates everything. So that's what Tiberius is saying here, is that Caligula, he's going to be a Phaethon. He's going to destroy everything. And this is why there were some kind of rumors circulating. The whole reason that Tiberius kind of looked to Caligula to succeed him is because in retrospect, he would look good just because Caligula was so bad. The method of execution Caligula preferred was to inflict numerous small wounds, and his familiar order, "make him feel that he is dying," soon became proverbial. Once, when the wrong man had been killed owing to a confusion of names, he announced that the victim had equally deserved death, and he often quoted Accius's line, and Accius is a dramatist, "Let them hate me so long as they fear me." He would indiscriminately abuse the Senate as having been friends of Sejanus or informers against his mothers and brothers. The knights, that is the equestrians, earned his constant displeasure for spending their time, or so he complained, at the play or the games. On one occasion, the people cheered the team he opposed. He cried angrily, "I wish all you Romans had only one neck," meaning that he wished they had one neck so that he could kill them all with one quick snap. All right, clearly a disaster, right? And he in turn is succeeded by actually his uncle Claudius. And you can see a little bit longer reign, 41 to 54. And here is Claudius. At times he looks a little bit kind of odd. I don't know how to explain it, but anyways, and for the longest time, and I mentioned this in the content in the unit, people didn't expect Claudius to become emperor. He was always around the household because he's related, he's the son or whatever, but he kind of was nerdish or bookish, so he spent too much time kind of in his books, not enough time kind of in the military and politics. So he was just considered, he's a little bit of an introvert. And the story also goes that the whole reason that the Praetorian Guard chose Claudius as emperor, because they did kind of select him, is because he was such a joke, because nobody ever thought that he would be successful. And just take a look. I've always amused by this passage from Suetonius, which discusses his upbringing. And this is, Suetonius talks about, is just how surprising it was that Claudius ended up becoming emperor. Because what you're going to see here is that he didn't come from a kind of healthy family situation. Consider this. This is one of my favorite passages from antiquity. It says, Claudius's mother, Antonia, often called him a monster, a man whom nature had not finished but had merely begun. I think that's just such a great line. I mean, it's so vicious because it's about her son, but just such a great line. And if she ever accused anyone of stupidity, would exclaim, "He is a bigger fool than even my son Claudius." Right? Like, supportive situation. Livia, his grandmother, and that's Augustus's wife, never failed to treat him with the deepest scorn and seldom addressed him personally. She couldn't even look at him. Her reproofs came in the form of brief, bitter letters or oral messages. When his sister Livilla heard someone predict that he would one day succeed to the throne, she prayed openly and aloud the Roman people might be spared so cruel and undeserved a misfortune. Right, so this crazy beginnings that he have, but he kind of shows them all wrong in a sense, because he becomes emperor, and you know what, as I mentioned in the notes, he actually is pretty good. Yeah, as I say, he became a relatively, competent emperor in terms of administration, set up a lot of different kind of important departments, undertook the invasion of Britain and other things. Uh, his choice of wife, on the other hand, not as good. He had a couple of them, but Agrippina was a very ambitious woman, a fascinating woman. I'm going to kind of expand on her in a second. This is, she has the son Nero. So from a previous marriage. And so Agrippina, when she's married to Claudius, she wants her son Nero eventually to become emperor. And the story goes that she poisoned Claudius in order to make this happen. Now, whenever an emperor died, there was always, if it wasn't obvious what had killed him, there was always kind of rumors about poisoning and plots and all that kind of stuff. But who knows? But perhaps she did. But anyways, her son Nero does come to the throne. You can see him here, another kind of nasty, brutish guy, 17 years of age. And as I mentioned in the content for the unit, just think about how far we've come from the age of Augustus, which wasn't that long ago. Augustus taking great concern and care in the selection of his successor, but now what we have is Agrippina poisoning the emperor to make sure that her 17-year-old son comes to the throne. Now compare this, remember, in the late Republic when we talked about the Cursus Honorum, where even a consul had to be in his 40s before he could become consul, but now at 17 he's emperor. So it just shows you how much things have changed. At the beginning, because he was so young, people thought, hey, we can control Nero and then kind of mold him into what we want. So they do have hopes that they can turn him into something good, but his kind of inner nature, in a sense, comes out and he turns into a tyrant. And one of the things that kind of displays this is he decides to kill his mother, Agrippina, because she is just too controlling. Now, the Roman the Roman historian Tacitus includes an account of the death of Agrippina. Agrippina is a remarkable woman. She actually wrote some memoirs. Unfortunately, they don't exist. They were lost to time, but she's a really fascinating woman. Now, this story about her death kind of ties into a few things here. Nero and his mother Agrippina, and of course the royal family, they're actually down in the Bay of Naples, which I talked about a moment ago with Capri, on kind of summer holiday, because usually you'd escape the hot city, Rome, in August especially, you'd leave the city just as they do today to go elsewhere. So they go down to the Bay of Naples. And what happens is Nero wants to kill his mother, but of course he knew that it would be outrageous and people would, Roman public would freak out if they know that he kind of killed her, by himself or, murdered her or whatever. So he had to make it look like an accident. So the first thing he did is they rigged this boat, because she liked to go kind of sailing in the Bay of Naples. They rigged it to fall apart when she was in the middle. So what happened is this boat goes out with her, and of course there's other people with her, right? It's a big boat. Anyways, it starts falling apart and it starts sinking. So the idea is that hopefully now she's going to drown, right? It'll look like a natural accident. But Agrippina, what she does is she swims to the shore. Right, so heavy cloak and everything. I just got to see her doing this breaststroke right to the shore, and then when this all happens, she's a smart woman. She realized that hey, this is probably, this isn't an accident. So she goes to her villa, and of course she's tired and experiences kind of trauma. She goes to bed in a sense to recover. Then what happens is the news gets to Nero and the Praetorian Guard that she survived this assassination attempt. So at that point, well, it's just time to take matters in hand and do it as violently as necessary. So what happens is Nero sends his henchmen to go dispatch her. So this is what happens in this passage here from Tacitus. And it's this great death scene of Agrippina. And it just kind of goes to show you how brutal these politics could be. Anyways, one of his henchmen, one of the kind of guards that worked under Nero, his name is Anicetus. He says, Anicetus drew a cordon around the villa in which Agrippina was staying, so kind of close it off, and then kicking down or breaking down the entrance, dragged off the slaves as they appeared, because they're trying to protect Agrippina, until he reached the bedroom door. A few servants were standing by, the rest had fled in terror at the inrush of men. In the chamber was a dim light and a single waiting maid, and Agrippina's anxiety deepened every instant. Why no one from her son? That is, why isn't someone coming to say, how's she doing? Now, nothing but solitude, hoarse alarms, and the symptoms of irremediable ill. Then the maid rose to go. Do you forsake me too? She began, right? As she turns to the maid and saw Anicetus behind her, accompanied by Herculeus, the Triarch, and Oberitus, the Centurion of Marines. These are just kind of Nero's henchmen. If he had come to visit the sick, he might take back word that she felt refreshed. If to do murder, she would believe nothing of her son. Matricide was no article of their instructions. The executioners surrounded the couch, and the Triarch began by striking her on the head with a club. The centurion was drawing his sword to make an end when she offered her womb to the blow. Strike here, she exclaimed, and it was dispatched with repeated uh, wounds. Excuse me. So you can see in her deathbed, what she says is that if you come here to find out how I'm doing, tell my son I'm fine, I'm refreshed. If you come here to murder me, just let him know I don't believe that in a sense that was his thing. But what's remarkable, right, is that when she realizes the kind of the jig is up or whatever, you can see she points to her womb, right, from whence, of course, Nero comes and says, "This is where I want you to kill me." Right? I think that's just a remarkable ending by this woman that just lived this long, or not that long, but this extraordinary life. You know, from Germanicus through her husband, through Nero, and everybody. Just really remarkable. Just it's almost like a drama or a tragedy here. Of course, remember Nero dies in 68. Kind of panics and flees the city and dies. And he had named, of course, no successor. There's no one around. So what happens is, of course, you know, that there is a contest among some of the leading generals. And in 69, we have the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, where Galba, Otto, and Vitellius and Vespasian each in turn kind of proclaim themselves emperor, with Vespasian coming out on top. And this is the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. So Vespasian is followed by his son Titus, who kind of dies quite soon, and then Domitian. That kind of rounds out the first century. Here is a picture of, or some busts of Vespasian. And what you kind of notice about them is you can see they're kind of realistic, right? In terms of, you can see the wrinkles in the brows and so forth. So you're familiar with the realism. So I think we've talked about in the notes how Vespasian's from the Italian countryside, kind of rural bourgeoisie. So I think he wanted to mark a departure from the Julio-Claudians, and one way you could do this was through art. Remember with Augustus, we saw a lot of classicizing tendency, but I think with this more realism now, it's kind of representative of this new sensibility of this new regime. And of course, another way he does this to mark his departure from people like Nero, and I'll talk about this shortly enough, is by building the Colosseum. The Colosseum is more formally known as the Flavian Amphitheater. That is the amphitheater built by the Flavian family, because it is begun, construction is begun under Vespasian, but it takes a long time, and it's completed and kind of inaugurated opening day under Titus. And I'm going to end it there because the Colosseum is actually the next subject to discuss in this unit. So hopefully this has provided a little bit of a different side of some of these emperors, and also to say the importance of public reactions.